4.5 years ago. I've changed it a little bit. You may recognize some of the stories, but I hope you enjoyed it if this is the first time you've seen it. So let's begin. It's going to be tough for me to see the screen. Is that the screen that'll show what the people at home are seeing? Okay. Should we start with the little music, Martin, or? Just to get us in the mood. When I first did this at Fringe, we opened that way, and I was in the curtains trembling because I'd never done it before. So I would like to begin this, and you may remember this from the original presentation. I would like to introduce to you my rabbi. This is Rabbi Shankman. Rabbi Shankman was my rabbi, this is scary to say, 60 years ago. He married my mother and father. I was petrified of him, absolutely petrified. And when I was studying for confirmation and bar mitzvah, he would come into our class every once in a while. And he came in one day, and one of the things he was talking about, which I'm going to talk about today, is the word Jew, and how many people take it in a negative way. If you listen to television and the news, they always avoid the word Jew. They'll say Christian people, Muslim people. They'll say Christians, Muslims, and Jewish people. They will never say Jew, certainly not in the singular. I think he's a Jew. They will avoid that at all costs. So he was talking about why that is. And he walked into the bar mitzvah class. There were about 6 or 8 of us. And he was trying to explain this premise. And he asked the class, he said, to make his point, how many in this class would like to go to Hebrew University? Well, everybody raised their hand, of course, including me. I don't know why. I didn't really want to go there. I wanted to go to Boston, but I raised my hand anyway. And he said, who would like to go to Jew college? Everybody heard that, and they looked down, embarrassed. And the rabbi said, does anybody want to go to Jew college? And of course, I raised my hand. And the rabbi walked up to me, and he said, Mr. Wolfsie, why would you go to Jew college? And I said, well, Rabbi, it sounds like it might be a little cheaper. And he looked at me. I was never so, and he said, I want you to see me in my office immediately after this class. I was absolutely petrified. So after class, I went to see Rabbi Shankman. I walked in, he said, sit down. And I sat down. And then he said, no, on the other hand, stand up. So I stood up, and he said to me, I just want to tell you something. And he put his arms around me, and he said, that's the funniest thing I ever heard in my life. The reason I love that story is because Rabbi Shankman recognized something about Jewish humor. It's self-deprecation, the ability to make fun of yourself. And that's one of the 3 stools of or legs of what Jewish humor is all about. So we're going to talk about this morning. And I want to tell you one quick story. And let's put up that next slide, Martin. This is what I used for my beginning of my premise for Fringe. But Mary Ellen is very interested in, what do you call it again? The Ancestry.com. So she said to me, you want to check your ancestry. And I said, well, I'm sure I'm just like Mary Ellen's many different things. I'm sure I'm very eclectic, and I have roots everywhere if you go back and look at my genetic history. So Mary Ellen sent it in, and about 2 or 3 months later, I got this in the mail. It was a gift from my wife. The question about what my religion was. There's no question that I was Jewish. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And let's go to that. The first thing we're going to talk, show you something very interesting to set us up for. This is not the actual book, though. I do have the book, but it's so valuable, I don't want to bring it here. This is a book. Oh, I have to stay in front of the mic, don't I? This is a book of Jew jokes. Notice how the word has a certain connotation when we say that. You seeing this would assume, and you would be right, that these are anti-Semitic jokes, okay? There's hundreds and hundreds of them. But here is the fascinating thing about this book. Many of the jokes in this book, Jew jokes, are actually jokes that Jews tell about themselves as well. There's sometimes a slight change in the joke, and I'll give you some great examples of that later. But oftentimes a Jew joke is remanufactured to be self-deprecating because that's what Jews do best, and that's the nature of their humor. Now let's talk a little bit about where that humor comes from. All jokes that Jews make are based, or many people make, based on stereotypes. Now I know as progressives here in this room and at home, we probably don't like the idea of stereotypes. But the truth is that stereotypes, in order to work at all, have to have a little bit of truth to them, or they make no sense and they're not funny. I don't know if you've ever heard or seen Jackie Mason. I used to go to New York just to hear his Broadway show. And his whole show is based on stereotypes. The biggest laugh he gets, and I remember this very well in the theater, was he tells about the fact that at intermission, the Jews and the Gentiles will go out into the lobby, and the Jews will say, "Did you eat? Did you eat? Did you eat?" And the Gentiles will say, "Do you want to get a drink? Do you want to get a drink?" Now, of course, that's not always true, but there is an element of truth to that. Jews are probably more obsessed with food than Gentiles. Of course, that's not a blanket statement, but there is some truth to it, or it would not be fair. So let's take a look at some of the stereotypes that we might or might not accept. Again, if a stereotype doesn't have an element of truth, it's not funny. For example, there are no Jewish jokes, and I've read tens of thousands. There are no Jewish jokes about Jews being drunk. That's just not part of their culture, okay? That doesn't mean Jews don't drink, but unlike the Irish, okay, that's Hey, wait a second. Every Irishman isn't an alcoholic, obviously, but there is an element of truth to that. Otherwise, it would not be funny. And I put on some of the other stereotypes. Jews can't fix cars. Jackie Mason does a great thing where his car stops and they can't find out what's wrong. And his wife says, "Look under the hood." He goes, "Where's the hood?" He didn't know, he knows nothing, okay? So there's some truth to that. You just don't see a lot of Jewish mechanics. You don't see a lot of Jewish athletes. Yes, there are Jewish athletes, but as a general rule, Jews were not great athletes. Obviously, people like Sandy Koufax are an exception to that. There are no Jews jokes. There are no jokes about Jews being stupid. There are jokes about Jews being canny, C-A-N-N-Y. There are jokes about Jews being dishonest, loving money, but no jokes about Jews being stupid. There would be no truth to that stereotype. It wouldn't be funny. And the final one I want to mention here is, you see, can we put that other one back up in the corner? Oh, there he is. And this to me is the most fascinating thing about Judaism. And all the jokes I've read, there are no jokes about God being omnipotent and omnipresent. God plays a very special role in the Old Testament. He's sort of equal to man. He argues with Moses. He argues with Abraham. He argues with Job. And sometimes he loses the argument. He's much more of an equal character. So very few jokes emphasize God's strength and power. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a moment. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Before I go further, I want to introduce to you my family. And this is a great story. There you see me, that's the baby, and that's my dad next to me. And in the middle is my great-grandfather, who came over to this country in 1905, okay? And then next to him is his son, Irving, that's my grandfather, okay? By the way, there are only two people in this picture who speak English. Well, which of the two that don't speak English? My great-grandfather didn't speak a word of English. And of course, I spoke no English at that point, but I was a quick learner. So anyway, that's my family. When my grandfather came here to New York at Ellis Island, again, he spoke no English, but he faced something that is the bedrock of Jewish humor. And that is, what kind of a Jew was he going to be? Was he going to try to assimilate with other Jews in New York City, or was he going to try to keep his faith and be faithful to Judaism and its tradition? That is a conflict that every Jew faced that came to America. And it's also the basis of many, many, many jokes, like the one I told first about the mother thing who was circumcised. Do you try to fit in, or do you try to keep your faith? That's the basis of much of Jewish humor. Okay, let's go on to the next one, Martin. Oh, by the way, I meant to mention in the previous one that my great-grandfather was Hasidic. My grandfather was Orthodox. My father was conservative. I was Reform. And then we have that little guy over there, over here, who's Unitarian. So that's not a bad, that's really not a good trend in a way for Jews, but whatever. Okay. In the next few seconds, Martin's going to roll this every 5 or 10 seconds. I have put up, and this is my favorite part of this presentation, I have put up some of the great Jewish comics. And the thing to remember about this is that in almost every case here, these men and women either came themselves, or more likely their fathers or even their grandfathers came here from Western Europe, okay? All of these Jews, virtually every single one, had a couple of things in common. They became secular Jews. Their way of identifying with Judaism was not through the traditional study of Torah, because there are lots of ways to be Jewish. These people found an avenue to Judaism through the humor. By and large, everybody that Martin is showing you, everyone was secular. They were not religious, okay? In most cases, they were not good students. They were nonconformists, but they saw the world, and I love this aspect of this, but all of these great comedians saw the world as people did historically in Judaism see Jewish law. They looked at the ambiguities. They looked at the, what's that? Okay. They looked at the world a different way than most people looked at it. They looked at the ambiguities. They looked at turn of phrase. They try to see things from a different angle. That's what humor is. That's what humor is. And if you ask yourself, why are most, Mary Ellen and I last night watched the Mel Brooks film, and all the writers, it was about the writing in the 1950s. Everybody in the room was a Jew, okay? There is a propensity, just like historical Judaism looked at things at a different angle, for these people that were up on the screen to look at things at a different angle. And I'm sure you saw some of your favorites up there. Many of them have passed away, of course, but they were all great. So let's move on and talk a little bit about classic Jewish jokes. The important thing about understanding Jewish jokes, as I said, is that they're stories. And there are literally, you'll get a kick out of this. This is volume 1 of my book of Jewish jokes and stories. This is volume 20. And here's the Unitarian joke book right here. It said, okay. Now, there are no Unitarian jokes. There are jokes that are jokes, and then you stick Unitarians in them. But you can't do that with a Jewish joke. You can't take, I always make the analogy, you can't put a hole in a jelly donut and make it a bagel. You just can't stick a Jew in a joke and say it's a Jewish joke. It just doesn't work. And I'll give you some examples of that. So let's look at some of the classic, let's look at some of the classic Jewish jokes. Again, while it's nice for people to laugh, because that's kind of what I do for a living, but most Jewish jokes, the point of the joke is not to get you to laugh, but it's to get you to think. It is an elegant way of telling the truth, okay? So I'm going to start with this joke because it's a classic example of how, for it to be a Jewish joke, you can't change the nationalities of the people in the joke. So here's the joke. Forgive me if you've heard it, but it's a classic joke. Okay, so there are 4 people in the desert and they're dying of thirst. And the German says, "I'm so thirsty, I must have beer." And the Italian says, "I'm so thirsty, I must have wine." And the Frenchman says, "I'm so thirsty, I must have champagne." And the Jew says, "I'm so thirsty, I must have diabetes." Now, think for a moment if that joke would be funny if the Italian said that. People would say, what does that joke mean? That joke makes no sense. Of course it makes no sense, because there is a stereotype about Jews being obsessed with their health and worrying about everything. Is that true across the board? Of course not. But there had to be some truth in that stereotype for this to work. I'll give you another example. 3 Jews are waiting to assassinate Hitler. Okay, they're behind a rock. He's supposed to be there at noon. He's at 2. 12 o'clock, he's not there. 12:30, he's not there. 1:30, he's not there. And one Jew turns to the other and says, gee, I hope nothing happened. Okay, that joke makes no sense if that's 3 Asian people, right? It makes no sense, because within that is the stereotype of Jews being worried about their health, and worrying if people are late, worrying about everything, actually. And is everything all right is a common expression. Okay, let's look at the next one. This is clearly not a funny joke. Again, it's just a story, but it always encapsulates something about the truth. So historically in Judaism, the rabbi would come and hear the people who were divorcing, and he would hear both sides of the story. So the rabbi and the wife also went him. That's part of the tradition. So the rabbi's listening to the story, and the man tells why he wants a divorce. And the rabbi goes, I think you're right about this. And then the woman tells her story. And the rabbi listens carefully. She says, he says, I think you're right as well. And with that, the wife says, sweetheart, she says, you're listening to both sides of the story and you're saying they're both right. They can't both be right. And the rabbi goes, I think you're right too. Well, what's the purpose of that joke? The purpose of that joke is to show that the way Jews have looked at everything, which is to look at both sides. In the Talmud, it says a stick has 2 ends. And what the rabbi, but you can interpret that joke in so many different ways, okay? So that's part of the idea of a Jewish joke, that you can listen to the joke and hear both sides of it. This is the most classic Jewish joke, and I have a lot to say about this because I get really upset when I hear people tell this joke and tell it incorrectly. And I will explain that, because that makes the whole difference in the joke. So the grandmother joke is the grandmother takes her little grandson out to the ocean, and suddenly a big wave comes and takes him out to sea. And she's just panic stricken. And she looks up to God and she says to God, God, if you bring him back the way he was, I will become the best Jew in the world. I will go to temple every Friday night. I will go to temple every Saturday morning. I will keep the kosher laws. Just please bring him back the way he was. I love him so much. And with that, a giant wave comes and deposits the little boy right in front of the grandmother. And the grandmother looks to the little boy, and then she looks up to God and she says, he had a hat. Okay, I do get laughs with that joke. But what's so interesting about that is that when I tell this joke to a group of Gentiles, which by the way is not a negative term, just for the Gentiles, anybody who's not a Jew, we are Gentiles to Muslims. So the interesting thing about that joke is once she says to God, bring him back the way he was, she is making a covenant with God. She has an agreement with God, okay? And he broke the agreement. She made a promise. He said he would. Now, what's so interesting is I've heard people tell this joke, and this is when it becomes anti-Semitic. And there is a form of that in where's that book? The one that doesn't matter, but the book where it said Jew jokes. I forget what it was. Oh, okay. There was a similar joke in here. And here's how I heard a Jewish comedian tell the joke. The way that he told the joke was, she turns to a lifeguard and she says, bring him back. And then when the lifeguard goes out and jeopardizes his life and brings her little boy back, she says to the lifeguard, he had a hat. Well, that is an anti-Semitic joke because she's not grateful. Isn't that right? She's not grateful. You can't tell the joke that way. It has to be God, because the whole history of Judaism is based on covenants that God had with the people to take them into Palestine. And you have to keep your agreement. That's why God punished the Jews. That's why they went, out into the desert. You have to keep your agreement. So when I hear that joke being told incorrectly, that really, really bothers me. Okay, this is great. I love this one too. Not a laugher, but it's one that gets you to think about Judaism and what it means. So, and by the way, I was so lucky to find that picture. That's an actual lithograph from the turn of the century. This joke is probably 100 years old. Do we have the right one up, Bert? Right? This one's on me. Anyway, it's a tailor talking to the Jewish man. Anyway, the Jewish man goes to the tailor a couple of months before Rosh Hashanah, the holiday. And he says to the tailor, you need to fix these pants. And the tailor says, okay. He says, we'll come back in a couple of days. And the Jew comes back to the tailor. They're both Jewish. And the tailor says, I'm sorry, they're not ready yet. So he comes back a week later. I'm sorry, says the tailor, they're not ready yet. Comes back 6 or 7 times. The pants are not ready. Finally, the day before Rosh Hashanah, he walks in, the tailor says, here are your pants. And the Jew says, the customer says, I don't understand something. It took the Lord 7 days to make the world, okay? And it took you 7 weeks to make these pants. And the tailor says, yeah. He says, but look at this world and look at these pants. Well, what's going on in that joke? Well, it is an example of what historically has been true of Judaism, if you read the Old Testament, that he's seeing himself as an equal to God. He can talk to God. He can sort of criticize God. That's okay. God has conversations with people throughout the Old Testament, and certainly there's reference to this in the Talmud. So again, the joke can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Okay, I keep saying it's my favorite, but this is my favorite. I'll tell you the joke, and then I'll tell you why it's important and why it became my favorite. 4 rabbis are having an argument about something. Big argument. 3 rabbis are on one side, and 1 rabbi, we'll call him Moshe, is on the other side of the argument. And Moshe is very frustrated. And he looks up to God and he says, God, if I'm right in this discussion, show me a sign. And with that, it was a beautiful day and the clouds come in. And the other 3 rabbis say, oh, that's a bunch of baloney. That's just the weather. It has nothing to do with the argument. A couple of minutes later, they're still arguing. And Moshe says, God, I need more of a sign. Show me that I'm correct. And with that, a thunderstorm comes in, rain and lightning. And the other rabbis go, that's nothing. That's just the weather this time of year. And finally, Moshe looks up to God and he says, God, you have to give me a definitive sign that I am right in this conversation. And with that, the heavens open up and God peeks through and he says, Moshe, you are correct. And the other rabbis go, okay, now it's 3-2. That is such a fascinating joke. And when I was giving my fringe speech, I met with the rabbi from the temple up on, gosh, it's just Reconstruction Temple, Rabbi Dennis. And I told him that joke. And he said to me, Dick, that is a story from the Talmud. And it became a joke. And the story in the Talmud is simply 4 rabbis having an argument. And one of the rabbis says, not as a joke, but he says, let's look to God for the answer. And the other rabbi said, no, God has already given us the law at Mount Sinai. Our obligation is to read the law and interpret it. The answer to our issues is not in heaven. And that is such a great joke, if you want to call it a joke, because it speaks to the historical Judaism and what it meant. And from that, and by the way, I could give you about 6 or 8 other examples of stories in the Bible that became jokes. And when I say became jokes, they didn't become jokes 3,000 years ago, but probably became jokes in the last 130 or 40 years with the migration from Western Europe. Okay, I think the next one is the tradition. Again, this is a joke that's not a huge ha-ha, but it tells a story. Okay, so 2 rabbis are having a tremendous argument about whether when you say the Shema, which is the classic Jewish prayer that you say supposedly 3 times a day, and they're arguing whether you're supposed to sit for that or stand for that. okay? And the argument goes on and on. And finally, one of the rabbis says, let's go talk to Rabbi Stein. He was a rabbi here for 40 years. He's probably 95 years old, but he will know what the tradition is. What is the tradition? He will know it. We shouldn't be arguing this. Let's find the tradition. So they knock on Rabbi Stein's door, and he comes to answers the door, and the one rabbi tells them what the argument is about. And the first rabbi says, now, Rabbi Stein, I think that the tradition is to stand when you say this prayer. And the rabbi goes, no, that was not the tradition. And the other rabbi is very excited. He says, well, Rabbi, my feeling is that the tradition is to stand for this. I forget which I did first. And the rabbi goes, no, that's not the tradition. Well, the two rabbis are very upset. If we go back to our congregation and tell them that there's no answer to this, that there's no tradition, they'll be backbiting, they'll be screaming, they'll be yelling, people will be saying horrible things about each other. And the rabbi says, yes, that's the tradition. Again, it speaks to the whole thing about Jews historically debating everything. Okay, God gave us the law, that's in the Old Testament, but the entire history, 4,000 years, including the Talmud and other writings, is all about debate. Okay. So I just want to wrap this up. I think I've got a few minutes left. One of the things that I did when I gave this presentation is I told things called Jewishy jokes. Those are jokes that aren't clearly Jewish, because remember, to be a really Jewish joke, you can't substitute another nationality or religion in the joke. It has to be culturally Jewish. So I told some Jewishy jokes. Mary Ellen had a favorite, which I'll tell now. If I have time to tell just two more quick. I'm going to tell her favorite, and then I'm going to tell my two favorites. But I'll tell yours first. This is not a Jewish joke. This is just a joke that is funnier because it's a Jew, okay? So it's in the Old West, and there's a Jew who needs to get across the prairie, and he says to one of the people on the stagecoach, he says, well, could it be okay if I could ride with you? And the stagecoach driver says, yes, but if you do, you have to hold the rifle and shoot Indians. Amy? What was that? You have to stand next, you have to sit on the stagecoach with me with a rifle. And the Jew goes, oh, I've never held a gun. I can't do that. He says, it's easy. Just do it for me. Says, well, if you want me to, I will. So they start to ride, and the Jew has the gun, the rifle, and all of a sudden he sees an Indian up ahead. He says, well, should I shoot? And the driver says, no, don't shoot now. We're too far away. That was a good sound effect. Don't shoot now, we're too far away. So the stagecoach gets a little closer to the Indian. Well, should I shoot now? No, don't shoot now. He's still too far away. Go a little closer. Well, can I shoot? Finally, can I? No, you cannot shoot. We have to get closer. We have to get closer. Finally, the stagecoach gets right next to the Indian, and the stagecoach driver says, okay, shoot now. And the Jew goes, well, I can't. I've known him since he was this big. So that's our favorite. My two favorites are, so Sadie goes home to her husband. Her husband goes home to Sadie, and he says, Sadie, I want when we make love that you should moan. She says, what, moan? I've never moaned our whole marriage when we make love. He says, well, it's very important to me that you moan. I've seen it on TV. I've seen it in some things I shouldn't be watching, but I want you to moan. She says, well, if this is important to you, I will do it. Again, this is only funnier because it's Jewish. So they get into bed and they're making love. And she says, well, should I moan now? He says, no, not yet, not yet. You have to wait. And they make love of another minute or so. Well, can I moan now? No, you have to wait. It has to be the perfect time. Finally, after 2 or 3 minutes, he says, okay, you can moan now. And Sadie goes, oi, did I have a bad day? See why that's funnier if it's Jewish? And my last one that I'll tell is, I'm just trying to think which one I'm going to tell. Oh, I just love this. It's Thanksgiving time in the Old South. And a woman calls up the base in town, and she says, I would like to invite some soldiers over for Thanksgiving dinner. And the receptionist, she says, well, she says, that would be terrific. And the woman says in her Southern accent, she says, yeah, but I don't want, she says, I'm not doing Jewish again. She says, I don't want any black people, okay? I'm sorry, I just blew my own joke. She says, I don't want any Jews. I don't want any Jews. I don't like Jews. I don't want Jews in my house. You can send anybody you want, but I don't want Jews. And the receptionist says, well, she says, I'll tell the captain that. And the next morning, the doorbell rings and she answers the door. And there standing there are 4 black soldiers, 6 feet plus tall, husky men, all African-American, all black. And she turns to one of the soldiers and she says, there must be some mistake. And the soldier says, oh, Captain Bernstein never makes a mistake. Okay. Well, the timing on that was a little bit off, but that's okay. That's okay. Hey, thank you very much for listening to this. I'm sort of been obsessed with this since I was in college, and it's always an opportunity to tell that story. So thank you, folks, very much.